Shannon Convoy was born on April 19, 1969, in the small town of Anderson, Indiana. She was one of 3 children in a very religious family. When Shannon's parents decided to divorce, she, along with her 2 brothers and mother, moved to Florida, where her mother remarried in 1975. Her new stepfather had 6 children from previous marriages, and Shannon gained many new brothers and sisters. Later, Shannon's mother and stepfather had another child together. Growing up in this large, tight-knit family, Shannon always dreamed of having a similar family of her own. From an early age, she loved drawing and sewing, and was known for her kind and sociable nature. She was even trusted with babysitting the neighbors' children. After graduating from high school in 1987, Shannon attended Florida's Tallahassee State University and later a community college, where she earned a scholarship and an associate's degree in design. Although she wasn't the life of the party, Shannon always stood out for her creativity and bright vision. In 1989, at the age of 20, Shannon met Clay Starbuck, a 20-something at a church dance. Clay had already been married before and had 2 children from that previous marriage. Despite their differences, Shannon and Clay felt an instant mutual attraction. On June 1, 1990, they married in Florida. Clay continued to work as an oil pipeline manager, often away for weeks on end. Though the separation was difficult, Shannon remained in love with her husband and embraced his children as her own. The couple moved to Alaska, and at the age of 21, Shannon gave birth to their first son, Austin. A few years later, they had another son, Blake, and in 1996, they welcomed their first daughter, Logan. Logan was diagnosed with autism, but Shannon took the news with calm acceptance, determined to give her child all the care and attention needed. Later, the couple had another daughter, Siren. Despite the joys of family life, their marriage was far from perfect. Shannon discovered that Clay had been unfaithful during one of his shifts with a colleague. In addition, Clay wasn't as devoted to the church as Shannon had hoped. Eventually, in March 2000, they divorced. Shannon and her children moved to Arizona, where she began dating another man. However, she still loved Clay, and suggested they give their marriage another try. They reconciled and moved back to Alaska. By 2001, they had another son, Marshall, but Clay suspected the child wasn't his, as the timing of the conception coincided with Shannon's time in Arizona. Despite his doubts, he accepted Marshall as his own. In December 2006, the couple remarried, but their relationship continued to face struggles. In May 2008, they moved to the small town of Deer Park with a population of just 3,000. Shannon immediately fell in love with the quiet, safe environment, which seemed perfect for raising their children. Clay continued working on the oil pipeline in Alaska while Shannon took care of the children and engaged in her church activities. However, doubts about Clay's loyalty resurfaced, and in June 2010, they separated again. At the age of 41, Shannon became a single mother with 5 children. In February 2011, Clay suffered a serious back injury while working in Alaska and was forced to take disability. With his reduced income, he couldn't keep up with his child support payments, but he continued to support his children as best as he could. Despite the breakup, he proposed they get back together, but Shannon was hesitant as their financial situation had changed. To support her family, Shannon enrolled in dental hygienist courses, excelling in her studies and eventually graduating with honors in the summer of 2011. She soon found a job in dentistry. At 42, Shannon decided to improve her personal life and created a profile on a dating site. However, on December 1, 2011, Shannon's 15-year-old daughter, Logan, became worried when her mother didn't show up to pick up the children from school. It was completely out of character for Shannon to miss this responsibility. Logan texted her mother multiple times but received no response. Shannon's last message indicated that Clay would be picking them up, but even after waiting the full 20 minutes, he never arrived. Logan contacted her older brother Austin, who was working at a local glass company. Austin, concerned, went to check on his mother. Clay, who had been resting after an injury, hadn't received any messages and was unaware of the situation. Despite Austin's concerns, Clay convinced him to leave it for the time being. But later that evening, after Shannon failed to show up for a game and ignored multiple calls, Austin became increasingly worried. Clay and the children eventually drove to Shannon's house, but the door was locked and no one answered. They didn't break in, deciding instead to return to Clay's house for the night. The next day, still no word from Shannon. By the evening of December 2nd, both Clay and Shannon's mother, who lived in Florida, were seriously worried and contacted the police. At 6:15 p.m., 2 police officers arrived at Shannon's home. After knocking and inspecting the area, they noticed nothing unusual. However, a package was sitting on the doorstep. After a brief inspection, the officers left. Around 7 p.m., Clay called the police again, expressing his concern. This time, officers agreed to return. After another visit, the police were able to enter the house the following morning, December 3rd. Initially, everything seemed normal, but when they reached Shannon's bedroom, they were shocked to find her lifeless body on the bed. She had been brutally beaten and tortured. Her body showed clear signs of trauma, and a vibrator had been left inside her posthumously. The room seemed eerily normal, with her phone and a bottle of lubricant on the bedside table. But everything was turned upside down, the bedding had been removed, and her body was the center of a horrifying crime scene. There were a lot of sex toys everywhere. This situation seemed strange, especially considering that Shannon was a very religious and modest woman who wouldn't typically express her secret desires. According to the investigators, however, this odd behavior pointed to the actions of the criminal. The killer didn't just want to murder Shannon but seemed intent on humiliating her. Everything about the crime scene indicated a deeply personal motive. At the crime scene, evidence was collected, including several sets of fingerprints and bloodstains. All items were seized, and investigators took whatever could offer information. Shannon's body was sent for a forensic examination. Later, Shannon's ex-husband, Clay Starbuck, arrived at her house. The police had not informed him of what had happened, but when he saw the area cordoned off, he realized something terrible had occurred. He eventually learned the grim truth, and provided the first significant lead for the investigation. According to Clay, Shannon had recently started actively dating men, meeting them through a dating app. She had several lovers at the same time. Clay had warned her several times that this could end badly, but she ignored him. He went on to tell detectives that he had a good relationship with his ex-wife and provided information about the dating sites where Shannon had profiles. Clay mentioned that he had seen Shannon in person about 5-6 days prior and that they usually communicated through online messaging. Distraught over what had happened, Clay insisted that the police focus on Shannon's recent acquaintances, particularly the men she had been in contact with online. He also told investigators that he believed Shannon had been unfaithful during their marriage. He had discovered nude photographs of her on her computer, sent to other men. Throughout his interrogation, Clay was visibly upset and cried frequently. Eventually, he was sent home to his children to calm down. Once back at the house, he reiterated his story and mentioned that Shannon had recently been visiting graphic websites, which even their children knew about and were upset by. The police canvassed the neighborhood to search for witnesses, but no one had seen anything unusual. They then turned to the public for help in gathering any useful information. Meanwhile, a forensic expert conducted an autopsy and uncovered the horrifying extent of the victim's torture. Shannon had 10 broken ribs, a crushed larynx, and signs of repeated beatings and bruising. There were also marks on her skin resembling stun gun injuries. Based on the cadaveric stains, it was evident that her body had been moved, she had been raped, and hair that didn't belong to her was found on her body. However, determining the exact time of death was difficult. It was believed that she had been killed sometime between the evening of December 1st and the early morning hours of December 2nd. The cause of death was asphyxiation due to the crushing of her throat, and she likely didn't die immediately. Investigators believed Shannon suffered for about 2 hours before her lungs filled with fluid, ultimately suffocating her. The autopsy revealed approximately 90 wounds and injuries on her body. DNA samples were taken from the crime scene in hopes of identifying the killer, but the process of matching DNA would take time. On December 5th, Clay met with the lead detective, where he was interrogated for about 5 hours. He actively cooperated with the investigation, providing his fingerprints and DNA samples. He even allowed investigators to photograph his body to rule out any injuries that might link him to the crime. However, nothing could be found that directly tied him to the murder. Shannon's children also spoke to the police, expressing their concern over their mother's online activity. They knew that dating sites could be dangerous, full of predators looking for vulnerable victims. The next day, Clay provided detectives with detailed information about how he spent December 1st, the day before his ex-wife disappeared. Despite Clay being a suspect, none of the fingerprints found at the crime scene matched his, and he had no criminal record. Most of his statements were confirmed during a second round of questioning, so he was released. After investigators checked Shannon's phone records, they noticed something odd. Between 8:06 and 8:47 a.m. on December 1st, she had been messaging a man named Euchre. They had met online a month before the tragedy, and they had gone on a date on December 5th. Just hours before her death, they had exchanged suggestive messages. Euchre had asked Shannon to send him a photo using a sex toy, though she never actually sent it. It was suspicious that the position in which Shannon's body was found matched the description Euchre had requested. Detectives easily traced Euchre's information through Shannon's phone. He willingly spoke with the police and provided a detailed alibi for December 1st. He had left work at 9:40 a.m. to attend a funeral about 30 kilometers away and returned to work around 11 a.m. He texted Shannon at 12:10 p.m., and she replied saying she was going to the bank. She later invited him to lunch at 1 p.m., but he declined because he had to stay at work. Shannon then asked him about meeting at a restaurant a little later, but he responded and the message was marked as unread. Euchre denied involvement in the crime, and his alibi was confirmed. He cooperated with investigators, providing DNA samples. The big problem was that the exact time of Shannon's death remained unclear. Despite the fact that none of the suspects seemed to be directly involved in the murder, detectives were careful not to rule anyone out too soon. The next suspect was John Wilson, another man who had been communicating with Shannon on the day of her death. Investigators soon discovered that his online profile was fake. He had been using a photo of a doctor from New York. They also learned that he had a meeting scheduled with Shannon on December 1st. Their relationship had started in September, but it wasn't serious. What stood out, however, was that John always called Shannon from payphones and used his work computer to correspond with her. When the police contacted John about the murder, he admitted that his name wasn't actually John Wilson, but he refused to reveal his real identity. Surveillance footage, however, helped identify him. The man was eventually found to be John Chanon, a high school teacher with a wife and children. He admitted that he had visited Shannon's house at around 10:30 a.m. on December 1st for their scheduled meeting. When no one answered the door, he called Shannon from a payphone, but got no response. He then walked around her house, peeking in the windows, but saw nothing unusual. Afterward, he tried to contact her several times, but received no response. The investigators were also suspicious because after speaking with the police, John hired a lawyer, which only added to their concerns. After a period of time, the man known as John Wilson hired a lawyer and agreed to meet with the police on December 17th, but only in the presence of his attorney. When he showed up, he was a completely different person from the man portrayed in his dating profile. His real name was John Chanon, and he was a high school teacher, married with children. He admitted to using a fake name and photo online to protect his reputation and his marriage. He didn't want his marital status to be exposed, and so he kept his relationship with Shannon a secret. John provided investigators with some interesting details. He confirmed that on December 1st, around 10:30 a.m., he drove to Shannon's house for their appointment. However, when he knocked on the door, no one answered. He tried calling Shannon from a nearby payphone, but she didn't pick up. After walking around the house and peeking through the windows, he found nothing unusual. He later used a computer at a library to check his messages, but Shannon's responses seemed strange and she unexpectedly canceled their plans. John tried calling again later in the evening, around 10:30 p.m., and this time it seemed like someone was inside the house, but once again there was no response to his knock. He called her one last time from a payphone, but his call went unanswered. Before heading home, he stopped by Walmart to buy window cleaning products. Investigators later confirmed all the information John provided, but the purchase of the window cleaner raised some suspicions. It could have been intended to help the killer cover up traces of the crime, although such a product wasn't typically associated with that purpose. Despite having 3 main suspects, the police still didn't have enough concrete evidence to charge anyone. All they had were indirect clues, and they couldn't confidently pinpoint the murderer. They were leaning toward Clay, Shannon's ex-husband, due to his odd behavior and strong motive. While reviewing the call log on Shannon's mobile phone, investigators discovered an outgoing call made on December 1st at 9:18 a.m. that wasn't listed on the phone's call history. It appeared that someone had deleted the call, which had been made to 911. The dispatcher had received only a scream and some indecipherable noise before the call was abruptly cut off. At the time, Shannon's location, based on GPS data, placed her at home. The dispatcher had initially assumed the noise was just children playing and didn't send a patrol to check. However, in light of the new information, the dispatcher realized it sounded like a struggle. This discovery helped narrow down the approximate time of the attack, and it became clear that after 10 a.m., all messages sent from Shannon's phone were part of a staged attempt to confuse the investigation. The killer seemed to know Shannon's family well, as the messages included specific instructions for her children on how to behave and even referred to them by name. The killer also posed as Shannon in the text messages with John, which further raised suspicion. When investigators cross-checked John's alibi, including his claim of buying coffee during the day, they ruled him out as a suspect. The focus then shifted back to Clay, who had become the primary person of interest. It was revealed that months before her death, Shannon had started noticing signs of being followed and believed someone was entering her house when she wasn't there. She had even installed a CCTV camera for security. However, on the day of her murder, the police found no trace of security measures in her house. This prompted them to dig deeper into Clay's actions. The investigation uncovered that Clay had been harboring deep resentment toward Shannon. He had been manipulating their children to turn them against her. According to Shannon's diary, Clay would show the children explicit photos of their mother, allegedly sent to men on dating apps, which caused tension between Shannon and the kids. It became clear that Clay had been trying to tarnish Shannon's reputation and discredit her after their divorce. Several people reported uncomfortable encounters with Clay, where he would casually mention Shannon's romantic life, revealing intimate and degrading details. On the day of her death, Clay's phone had been turned off, something he claimed he did regularly to avoid being disturbed while he slept. However, this was unusual, as the detectives found that Clay had never turned his phone off before. Clay's behavior began to appear increasingly suspicious. While initially acting as if he wanted to help with the investigation, it soon seemed like he was trying to control it. Evidence suggested that he had even installed a tracking device on Shannon's laptop to monitor her communications online. Shannon had confided in her family and friends, expressing that if anything happened to her, they should check Clay first. During a reinterrogation in January 2012, Clay became visibly nervous. He was asked about his car breaking down on the morning of December 1st, the day Shannon was killed. He claimed that the car had stalled in a nearby park and that he repeatedly tried to start it throughout the morning. He didn't manage to get it started until late in the afternoon. However, investigators found several security cameras along his route that should have captured footage of his car, but strangely there was no footage of him. Additionally, Clay's car started working perfectly in the evening when he drove to a match, which further raised doubts about his alibi. Taking all of this into consideration, detectives arrested Clay on February 6th, charging him with first-degree murder and burglary. His bail was set at $1 million, and he was forbidden from contacting his children. After a search of his home, investigators found a large number of missing items in Clay's storage room. By February 9th, the case against Clay had only grown stronger. The police added charges of rape to the list of crimes he was being accused of. At that time, Washington state still had the death penalty, so Clay faced the possibility of facing it in the near future. Throughout the investigation, Clay's children continued to support him. They refused to believe he had killed their mother, insisting that he had always accepted her for who she was, despite her flaws. The children believed the police were trying to frame their father. Clay's trial began in May 2013, and more than 7 witnesses were called to testify. The prosecution argued that Clay had used his knowledge of Shannon's daily routine, gained from monitoring her communications, to create a perfect alibi. He likely lured Shannon out of the house when she took the children to school, then broke into the house and hid, waiting for her return. When Shannon arrived, he attacked her, and in a fit of jealousy, he raped and murdered her. DNA found under her nails and on her neck confirmed that Clay had been in contact with her during the attack. The defense countered, arguing that the DNA could have been there because Clay had lived in the house months before the murder. They also pointed out an unidentified DNA sample found under Shannon's nails, which they claimed could belong to the real killer. They argued that much of the evidence against Clay was circumstantial. 20 witnesses testified for the defense, and Clay's children remained steadfast in their belief in his innocence. They also claimed that their father's serious illness meant he would not have been physically capable of committing such a brutal crime. In the end, the jury found Clay guilty of first-degree murder, as well as 4 of the 5 aggravating circumstances. His children spoke out in court, insisting that the verdict was a miscarriage of justice. Nevertheless, Clay was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Attempts to appeal the verdict were rejected. Thank you for watching.